With a career that spanned 3 decades, Johnny Carson was one of the biggest and brightest names in television history. Night after night, he welcomed America into his living room, creating an illusion of intimacy with Hollywood's most iconic stars. But behind the curtain and charm, the Tonight Show host was hiding the worst secrets that could have obliterated careers in an instant. "Johnny knew everything," recalled a former producer from the show's golden era. Celebrities would charm audiences, speak of love and family, while Carson, smiling politely, knew their entire image was a carefully crafted illusion, and their real lives were kept buried for survival. Number 7. Cary Grant. Johnny Carson once said, "Desire is the one secret of every man's career." Well, he didn't say education or being born with some kind of hidden talents, but desire, what we want, what we chase, and what we're forced to hide. And no one carried that weight more gracefully than Cary Grant. To the world, Archie was the very definition of polished masculinity. That voice, that posture, that ease with the camera. For decades, he was the man every woman dreamed of, and every man tried to imitate. But behind the tuxedos and red carpet smiles was a weird truth, one Carson never forgot. Grant shared a home with actor Randolph Scott for over a decade, a home famously nicknamed Bachelor Hall. This wasn't a hidden cabin in the hills. It was a beachfront property in Santa Monica. And what makes it so surreal is that they weren't exactly hiding. They posed for magazines. They were photographed in bathrobes, having breakfast together, and lifting weights in the backyard. And these were images of domestic life or boyhood. Still, the official line was, "just roommates." Studios worked hard to keep it that way. Carson once admitted how strange it felt to sit across from Grant, discussing his 5 marriages, knowing full well that none of them came close to the depth or longevity of his relationship with Scott. What haunted Carson wasn't judgment, but the performance, the double life. He understood the pressure, how someone like Archie, born into hardship, had to become Cary Grant just to survive the world he entered. The persona, the accent, and even the charm. It was all part of a carefully built identity, crafted as much for protection as it was for fame. Later in life, Carson would speak privately about how talk shows like his had become part of the machinery that helped maintain those illusions. And he didn't speak with bitterness, but with sorrow. A kind of quiet remorse that his stage, his desk, his questions had helped people hide parts of themselves out of fear. With Grant, that pain was especially sharp, because no matter how beloved the image was, Johnny knew the real cost of holding it together, and he never stopped thinking about it. Number 6. Rock Hudson. Hollywood's golden era was personified by Rock Hudson, who was tall, charming, and naturally attractive. He was loved by millions, became popular, and starred with Doris Day in love movies. However, Rock has been the subject of plenty of headlines, and let's say, not every detail was as glossy as the magazines made it seem. To the public, he was the ideal man, romantic and the kind who'd kiss the girl and ride into the sunset. But behind that image was something very different, and Johnny Carson knew it, and it troubled him more than most people ever realized. Hudson appeared on The Tonight Show several times over the years, always composed, always likable. But Carson, behind his calm exterior, was carrying a truth he couldn't speak. Rock Hudson was gay. Well, in those days, that wasn't just personal. It was professionally deadly. His whole career was engineered to keep that truth buried. People close to Carson recall how tense those interviews felt backstage. It wasn't just Hudson who was nervous. Carson was too. The pressure of interviewing someone, knowing that even the wrong tone of a question could destroy their life. That's not something you forget. Especially not for a man whose entire brand depended on women believing in the illusion. Hudson's agent, and Henry Wilson, took that illusion seriously. so seriously that he orchestrated a marriage between Rock and his own secretary, Phyllis Gates. The marriage didn't last long, but it did what it needed to: deflect questions, kill rumors, and keep the studio happy. And Johnny hated it. Not Hudson, never Hudson, but the system, the machinery, the lie. Carson, a man who made his living through conversation, quietly called it institutionalized lying. He saw how the pressure of maintaining these fake lives wore people down. And when Hudson died in 1985 of AIDS-related complications, it hit Johnny hard. That wasn't just a headline. That was a man he'd known, someone who'd lived decades under the weight of forced silence. In his later years, Carson talked about it often, how the industry demanded a polished mask and punished anyone who dared take it off. With Hudson, that mask stayed on until the very end, and Johnny never stopped thinking about the cost. Number 5. Marlon Brando. Every time Marlon walked into Carson's studio, there was a tension in the air. Not hostility, but something harder to name. Brando wasn't like the others. He didn't come to entertain. He came to challenge, to push, to control the space. And Carson, always sharp, always composed, found him impossible to predict. But what fascinated Carson more than Brando's on-air unpredictability was the contrast between who Brando was and who he pretended to be. On screen, Brando was fire and steel, the embodiment of truth. He ripped away artifice with every line he spoke. A streetcar named Desire. On the waterfront, not The Godfather. Every performance seemed to come from a place raw and real, but his private life was something else entirely. Johnny knew what the public didn't, that Brando's romantic life was more fluid, more complex than the tabloids ever suggested. The Tonight Show producer remembered Carson shaking his head after one of Brando's visits, saying, "The man who strips away all the masks on screen keeps his real one buried the deepest." During the height of his fame, Brando was carefully presented as a womanizer, linked to glamorous actresses, married multiple times, and father to many kids. But Carson, like many in Hollywood, knew that Brando's relationships with men, especially with fellow actors like James Dean, were just as real and just as defining. What intrigued Carson wasn't the secrecy itself, but the irony. Here was the man who redefined masculinity for the 20th century, who brought sensitivity and depth to the American male image, and yet had to live in a shadowed corner of himself. Later in life, Brando grew more open, mentioning in interviews that he'd had experiences with men. But by then, the damage had been done. The fiction long established, the public shielded from anything that didn't fit the myth. Carson often reflected on that contradiction. He saw in Brando a man walking a high wire, balancing authenticity with survival. He created just enough of a mask to be safe, while still forcing the culture to expand around him. It was a performance of its own kind, and Carson never stopped wondering how much it cost. Number 4. Raymond Burr. Raymond Burr's voice was unmistakable, deep, commanding, and then filled with a quiet authority that made viewers trust him. Whether he was playing Perry Mason or Robert Ironside, he was always the man with answers, the man who saw through lies. But Carson knew the truth. Burr's entire life off-screen was its own performance. Johnny interviewed Burr multiple times, and something always felt off. There was nothing malicious about him, but there was a weight, a stiffness that went beyond nerves. Later, Carson understood it. Burr wasn't just hiding his sexuality. He'd constructed an entire fictional life around it. Marriages that never happened. A wife and child were allegedly killed in a plane crash. None of it was true. Military service, injuries, were all fabricated. Carson found that tragic, not foolish, but profoundly sad. It wasn't enough for Burr to pretend to be straight, and he had to become a war-torn widower, a man shaped by loss, a figure who couldn't possibly be questioned. Carson said once, he built a shield no one would dare push against. In reality, Burr spent the final 35 years of his life with Robert Benavides, his partner in every way. Together they ran a vineyard, cultivated orchids, and built a quiet life. But publicly, Benavides was just his business partner. On air, Carson played along. What choice did he have? What haunted Johnny later was the psychological cost. Burr didn't just lie, he had to remember the lies. Names, dates, timelines, imagined pain, imagined war, imagined love, all to protect the truth of who he really loved. Carson often reflected on the irony. Burr played Perry Mason, the ultimate seeker of truth. But off-screen, the actor lived a reality that required constant invention, not because he wanted to deceive, but because the world gave him no other option. After Burr's death in 1993, Benavides began sharing more about their life together, and the lies slowly unraveled. But Carson never forgot what it took to keep them up for so long. He saw Burr's performance not just as survival, but as sacrifice, a quiet kind of bravery no one ever applauded. Number 3, Katharine Hepburn. Well, there's something super tragic about a love story everyone believes, especially when it was never truly real. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy were Hollywood's favorite couple. Their on-screen chemistry spanned decades, and their private romance was embraced as the real thing. But behind closed doors, Johnny Carson had a different perspective, one shaped by personal conversations with Hepburn herself and stories shared by those closest to her. Carson deeply respected Hepburn. Her sharp wit, her dignity, her independence, it stood out in a world obsessed with Polish. But he also recognized that the long-told tale of her great love with Tracy was more strategy than truth. He believed, as did many in his circle, that their 26-year relationship served a purpose. For Tracy, a devout Catholic unwilling to divorce his wife, it explained why he lived apart from her. For Hepburn, it provided the perfect alibi for a life largely lived on her own terms. Hepburn's closest bonds were with women. She lived for years with Laura Harding, and later, for decades, with her companion Phyllis Wilborn, who some biographers say she referred to as her wife. Carson found it fascinating how Hollywood had transformed this quiet, pragmatic arrangement with Tracy into its most beloved romantic saga. A myth sold through documentaries, books, and retrospectives, none of which acknowledged the deeper truth. Unlike other stars, Hepburn didn't play the publicity game the traditional way. She didn't stage fake dates or make appearances on red carpets with flavor-of-the-month actors. Instead, she built a private life far from Los Angeles in New York and Connecticut, where cameras weren't always waiting. And the Tracy story allowed her to do it without any kind of trouble. Carson admired that. He once remarked to a colleague that Hepburn's style, trousers, loafers, and minimal makeup, was a kind of quiet protest, and not loud or political, but still deeply intentional. She'd found a way to be partially herself in a world that punished difference. By the end of his career, Carson looked back on the Hepburn-Tracy story, not with cynicism, but with a clear-eyed understanding. The love story worked, just not in the way anyone thought. It wasn't passion, it was protection. And in that era, that was often the only way to survive. Number 2, Tyrone Power. There was a time when Tyrone Power's face could stop traffic. Chiseled cheekbones, intense eyes, and a jaw built for close-ups. He was 20th Century Fox's golden boy, the kind women pinned to their walls and men tried to imitate. But Johnny Carson, like many in Hollywood's back rooms, knew the story behind that face. Power never appeared on The Tonight Show. He died in 1958, before Carson took the desk. But his name came up often. Guests told stories, off camera and in whispers. And what fascinated Johnny wasn't just that Power was gay, or at least far more complicated than his public persona allowed. It was how flawlessly the studio had managed to separate who he was from who he had to be. During the day, he was the heartthrob. Magazine covers, photo shoots with his wives, arm-in-arm appearances with glamorous actresses. But after dark, insiders said, he slipped away into a private life no one dared discuss. Relationships with men, always discreet, always shielded. His marriages, first to French actress Annabella, then to Linda Christian, and finally to Debbie Ann Menardos, were more than just cover stories. They were functional arrangements, sometimes even affectionate, but carefully managed to preserve the illusion that Power belonged to the women who adored him. Carson found it tragic, but not unusual. Power, he said, was born into a system that turned beauty into a burden. His looks gave him everything and imprisoned him at the same time. The better he looked, the less freedom he had. There was a quote Johnny returned to often: "The prettier the cage, the more invisible the bars." And with Power, those bars were gilded. He couldn't risk honesty, not when his entire career depended on fantasy. The studios knew it. So did the fans. But no one dared break the spell. Power died of a heart attack at just 44. A man adored by millions, yet deeply unknown. Carson later said that Tyrone Power's life wasn't just a Hollywood tragedy. It was a lesson. That when a man's face becomes a brand, the person behind it gets erased, and what's left is a perfect image, framed, frozen, and untouchable. Number 1. James Dean. It's easy to immortalize someone when they die young, and with James, that's exactly what happened. He was 24, reckless behind the wheel, and already a legend by the time the crash ended everything. East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant. 3 films, and that was all it took. He became the face of youth, aching masculinity, and vulnerability. But Johnny Carson, though he never met Dean, was haunted by the stories he heard after the cameras stopped rolling. Dean didn't live long enough to be interviewed by Johnny, but guests, insiders, and old studio hands shared stories Carson never forgot, especially the ones that hinted at a much darker road to stardom. And there were constant whispers that Dean had formed sexual relationships with powerful men in exchange for roles, that his sexuality wasn't simply fluid, but strategic. Carson didn't judge Dean for that. He didn't see it as a moral failure. He saw it as a devastating indictment of the industry. What kind of system forces a gifted young actor to barter his body to be seen? And how does someone live with that when they're still trying to figure out who they are? Dean's most rumored connection was with director Rogers Brackett, who many say helped launch his career. Other names surfaced too, men who held keys to casting rooms and careers. Carson viewed it as one of the most tragic contradictions in Hollywood's machinery. The actor who embodied rebellion, possibly manipulated by the very forces he appeared to defy. The irony, Johnny said, it was that death made it easier. Because Dean never lived long enough to be dissected. His sexuality never became a scandal. His choices never came under fire. He died before he had to explain or hide or be outed. So the myths remained untouched. Dean, forever young, forever iconic, could carry both rebellion and submission in his legacy without resolution. Carson often reflected on how clean death made everything. All the contradictions got frozen in place. No fallout or confession, just a perfect image, sealed by tragedy. It wasn't admiration, it was grief, for what Dean might have become if Hollywood hadn't chewed him up first. If you found this video joyful, be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.